Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at Smith Square Hall. My name is Mia. I'm a producer at Intelligence Squared, and it is my real pleasure to be bringing you this leadership special installment of the Intelligence Squared Economic Outlook. Now, as ever, we are delighted to be working with our partners, Guinness Global Investors, on this series. For those of you that don't know, Guinness Global Investors is an independent British fund manager that helps individuals and institutions harness the drivers of future growth to reach their investment goals. With specialisms in Asia, sustainability, innovation, and income investing, they offer funds for the core of any equity portfolio. So if you would like to find out more, why not talk to your financial advisor or take a look at their website. But now, I am delighted to hand over to your incredible host this evening. It's BBC broadcaster Jonny Dymond.
Thank you very much, Mia, and welcome. Thank you very much. Welcome to this Intelligence Squared event. Tonight's conversation is part of the Intelligence Squared Economic Outlook series, which explores the forces shaping global markets, politics, and business. I'm Jonny Dymond, as just been introduced, and I'm delighted to be sitting down with Francine Lacqua to discuss leadership in particular and its impact on the global economy. I think you would probably not be here if you didn't know who Francine was. She is an editor-at-large for Bloomberg TV. She is the award-winning anchor of The Pulse with Francine Lacqua and Leaders with Francine Lacqua, and she has sat down with probably more CEOs, prime ministers and presidents than you can shake a stick at. She has also done this job in considerably more glamorous places than Smith Square. However beautiful this former church is, Davos, at the ECB Forum, and at IMF meetings all around the world. So it is a joy to have you here, Francine. Thank you very much indeed. Let us dive in, if we could, and talk about, if we can start with the leaders that you have met and interviewed, and just give us an idea of what you look for when you first sit down and you start talking with them.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Jonny. I'm so happy to be here in June. I mean, it was raining when I got up at 4 in the morning, and now it's sunny, so there's always an upside to everything that we do. Look, when we first of all decide to interview a leader, so you have the obvious G7, you have the heads of state to try and understand a story, and then a lot of them are chief executives that have gone through a tough time, an easy time, and trying to learn from them. So I've been at Bloomberg for 25 years. They've changed considerably just because the news has changed and what they focus on changed. And when I interview them, I think it really depends on where the conversation takes place. If it's an evening event, it's a little bit less combative than an early morning pure TV show interview. Yeah. What I look for is I mean, if they lie, it's no good. So yeah. I do look for some kind of honesty in the conversations, but also I think a little bit of stamina. So, you won't come on Bloomberg if you don't have much to say. So when we speak before, and I always say, look, this is what I'm looking for in the interview, and come prepared to give us real answers. So it could be the state of the world, it could be the state of their company, but there's always, we do an interview with a very clear purpose, and we make sure that they're ready to answer that question.
The people you speak to give, many of them, a fair number of interviews, and they will have lines to take. They will have certain things that they will say over and over again. Can you feel that when they're giving you the line to take, they're giving you a corporate line, and do you resent it?
I prepare for it. I don't know if I resent it. Yeah. And so we do, look, I do a lot of interviews. I do a lot of interviews of chief executives. I think on a daily basis, I'll do 3 or 4. The big interviews, the ones that are consequential, that are like half an hour, 1 hour, we really prepare. And so I'll go back and listen to other interviews. We'll look for patterns. And so I think there's a secret sauce in trying to draw out these chief executives to make sure that they don't say the same thing over and over. So some of them, if we talk about chief executives and not politicians, because I think you interview them differently. But if it's a chief executive that ate a management book and is always saying the same thing, and we decide actually they have an interesting story because it's a turnaround story, maybe it's a company that has gone through a lot of difficulties, maybe it's a company that's too bloated, and they chop into the workforce, then we try and come up with more clever questions. Yeah. I had a brilliant boss years ago, 15, 20 years ago, when I started doing the big interviews. And at the time, there was this, I started in covering oil, and there was this reporter who was extremely aggressive, and he was amazing because he could get anyone to say anything, especially with the oil ministers. And my boss said, Francine, you're your personality. I'm not the most aggressive. I know what I want, and I know what I want to ask. And she said, use that. So in your interviews with CEOs, just be more clever. Use your sense of humor. Use what you have as assets to try and get an information out. And so that's what I do in every interview. I use kind of the tools that I have at my disposal. And so sometimes it's not tricking them, but I ask a lot of what do you mean? Well, don't you think this? Like having a conversation, I wouldn't say with a pal, but an honest conversation in a business meeting where it's behind closed doors. So the real success is after the interview where they say, oh, I forgot that there was a camera. That means that you've had a good conversation. And I think if you have those honest conversations and you keep the pace and make sure that they answer them, it's kind of what makes the secret sauce of a good leadership interview.
A quick word about the format for this evening. Francine and I are going to talk until about 8 o'clock, and then we very much want to have your questions to Francine. And we will also be doing an online poll in about 20 minutes, which you'll see a QR code up on there, and you'll be able to vote, and then we'll discuss the results when they come in pretty much immediately. Let's talk about the individuals that you've spoken to. Of the leaders you have interviewed, whether it's business or politics, who has surprised you most and why?
Many, and everyone is a little bit of a surprise, especially if it's the first time you interview them, because you make assumptions of them watching them on TV or listening to them, and then maybe they come, they're very different one-on-one. I think the one that maybe surprised me the most was Emmanuel Macron. He's the French president. Yeah. I speak French. I listened to him many times giving either speeches in French or being interviewed in French. And then we sat down for 20 minutes and he spoke English. Wow, was that different? Because actually the English language is much more direct. He is often accused in France of speaking like 18th century French, and so very detached from the common person on the street. And in English, he was much more efficient. So he worked in English, in banking, and I don't know whether it's because it was a business language, but he was easier to follow. He had, I think, more policy, or he got to the points much quicker. And so for me, this was a real surprise. And even his aides, it was one of the first times that they actually heard him speak in English.
They were surprised as well.
They were surprised that he was so efficient. So a lot of the times, I ask around when I interview someone. Yeah. So if it's a head of state and they'll come in, usually they're busy with makeup or something else, and I'll spend a bit of time with their aides and saying is he having a good day? Is she on good form? Yeah. What's he like? And in those 3 minutes, I kind of try and gauge if there's something that on that day will make for a better interview. And sometimes, and for him, they said, well, he tends to speak a little bit long. It's not the case in English. So that was, sometimes in depending on what language you speak in, it really does make a difference.
Are the interviews when you are talking to people in times of crisis, are they very different from the sort of company results or the everyday? Does it feel that you are getting more out of people at a time of crisis, or are they more defensive?
So my favorite interviews are at times when they're relaxed. Right. So in times of earnings and times of crisis, I think they're important interviews. Earnings interview are extremely difficult to do because they've worked so hard on their statement to the markets and to the press that it's almost impossible to get them off script. So it's necessary, especially if there's big news or if they say something about the world economy or their financials. So those are interviews that we have to do, and that's fine. In times of crisis, again, it depends. If it's someone that has messed up, usually they don't want to talk to the press. Yeah. That's when you want to get them, because there's either an apology or self-reflection. If it's a time of crisis where chief executives or politicians feel like they've been wronged, it's an unpleasant interview because everything you ask, they take very personally. So there was a time, this was, a prime minister that, I gave a rough time too. It was a UK prime minister. And I think he took it really badly because he was going through a rough time and he thought he was doing good.
Can you share the name?
This was Rishi Sunak.
Right.
And I'd understood afterwards from his team that he felt that he was doing better than what the questions were thrown at him were suggesting. And again, that's fine, because actually we have a big newsroom. It's not, we work on the questions together. But it's interesting to see the psychology of the person that you interview. The ideal interview is when they're open and reflective. And so it really depends on how generous they are with their time and their thinking.
Do you get a sense from the interviews that you do of how much power individuals have? I mean, do you get the feeling after talking to them of whether or not they are able to drive through their vision, or whether they are constrained? Or do you not get the chance during an interview to sense that?
So I think you do, because you spend a bit of time with them in the green room if it's on stage, or if it's in the studio, you go to the green room. I like to go to the green room to say hello beforehand, just so that I see the mood and what they react to. And actually, often the most interesting interaction is with their team. So you have, again, this could be heads of state and chief executives, and I think it's very similar. You can see when someone's in charge, right? You can see by their demeanor, by their body language. Sometimes they'll say, right, what do you want to talk about? Or what's the first question? And it's different if they ask, or whether they're in a corner thinking about other stuff or on their phone, and it's their aides that do a lot of the talking. I mean, a former Italian prime minister who was twice before Meloni, really surprised me, because we were in Davos. It was one of the first interviews that he was doing. He was nervous about his English. And it was a pre-recorded. So I don't like pre-records because they can stop. There's always, it's messy. I like live, it's more fun. They're usually more focused. And so we start by doing the interview, and actually 2 of his aides stopped him and said, no, Mr. President, why don't you start on something more positive? And I thought, wow, this is a person that's not in charge of his own team, so let alone the country. And so in those tiny moments, I think you see a lot about a person's personality. You see a lot about how they want to govern, how they want to be perceived. And if you can't control your own team, then I think it's very difficult to do policy and push it through.
And do you get the sense from interviews, from the interactions you've had with people, that they are driving events or being driven by events? Do you get that much from them?
I mean, 2026, I think it's definitely events driving them. I think 2010 would have been a little bit different. When you look at, the world economy, or just the forces at play, you have AI, and there's 1,001 questions about where that goes. You have, instead of geopolitics, I would call it geostrategies. So you have poles of influence that used to work together that are now in competition for a number of things, be it trade routes, be it, supremacy on AI or arms. You have the control of energy and oil. You have influence, kind of going back to mercantilism. And so in this role, chief executives and leaders need to react. I don't know if they shape it. Maybe the US president is shaping it. Maybe the Chinese president is shaping it a little bit with ambitions. But otherwise, it's much more of a reactive. And when I speak to them, it's kind of, trying to make sure that you have an apparatus that is flexible enough to deal with all of these shocks coming at you. And I think that really has changed in the last 10 years. If you think about it, right, in the last 4 years, we've had 4 shocks. So we had COVID, lockdown, inflation went up, central banks didn't react to the way maybe they should have, because they mismanaged or miscalculated inflation and then overshot it. You had the war in Ukraine. That changed everything for the energy complex. Again, inflationary shock, maybe not the way that we thought it would play out. Then you have trade concerns, a trade war from the US. A lot of people held back, but still it was a big shock to the economy. And now you have AI and the war that's going on between Iran and the US. So, there are multiple of shocks. And I think a lot of chief executives find it hard to wade through all of this fog. They have difficulty in prioritizing. And a lot of them will be quite honest, actually, about the difficulty in being in charge where visibility is so little.
For 25 years there's been a bit of a debate about where power lies. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of concern about globalization and huge multinational companies taking power away from nation states. Financial crisis comes along, nation states are the sort of bankers and actors of last resort. And now again, a very powerful debate about whether or not power has swung back to business and away from political leaders. You talk to all of them. Do you have a feel for it? Do you have an opinion on it?
Well, when it comes to geopolitics or energy, this is definitely still with the states. When it comes to AI, it's very clear that the people that are most powerful in trying to deal with the technology and pushing the technology is the hyperscalers, so the ones that are building the infrastructure around it, and then the ones that are actually building the technical models. Now, I had a good conversation with the founder of Blackstone today, and he said a couple of surprising things, because you talk about AI, you say, look, where does it end? Who's really in charge? Do we need to regulate it? Is it safe for everyone to use? And you have 1,001 questions about that. And he says, look, it's a little bit like the light bulb, When the light bulb was invented, it doesn't matter that there was a light bulb, it was that there was this whole infrastructure, that grid, that now powers you. And so he sees the advent of AI as a necessity to upgrade our systems. So is it China that will end up winning this? Is it the US? Is it the LLMs? Is it AGI? He really sees it as a foundational work of this technology that will revolutionize humanity, and this has kind of like the big change in one of the forces that he's looking at.
And does that, again, to come back to that debate over business and nation states, does the way that he sees it draw from nation states, or?
I mean, AI is 100% private. Right, so you have OpenAI, you have DeepMind. Sure. So this is the power of the companies, and we're seeing this fight, especially between the U.S. and Anthropic, and trying to see who's controlling what and putting standards and saying you can't roll it out to foreign nationals. Yeah. But at the moment, unless you regulate it, or unless the government finds a way of absorbing it and taking over, it really is in the arm of not even private businesses, it's 3-4 companies that will control the way that we consume all of this. One of the questions that we spend quite a lot of time thinking about on the show is actually, where is Europe in all of this? Yeah. So where's Europe, where's in the UK? And the dependency that Europe has on these models, I don't think Europe really can catch up. So it's really the US and China. And a lot of it will depend on the chips that are made. And it changes, again, the social contract between the government and the individual, if now the power lies within 3 companies.
Yeah. Can we talk about turbulence, of which you've touched on, and how you see leaders responding to it, and what traits you think come out in turbulent periods that bring out the best in leaders? And I'm thinking about, decisiveness or judgment, stamina, their ability to communicate, good fortune. What is it that you think makes the great leader at a time of great turbulence? So
all of the above, but they also have to enjoy it. So if a chief executive, or again, a head of state finds it hard to deal with all of this, it means that they don't have the right stamina. So, and that's probably a temperament. Yep. It's a temperament that if you like a challenge, and if despite the challenges you want to grow, if despite the challenges you want to get better and further, then you'll be more successful. And I see that over and over again, right? I think a lot of the times I speak to big chief executives that have taken over banks or an absolute mess, or big, someone who wants power, but you don't really understand for what or how. And you understand, speaking to them, that it's about the power, but the ones that succeed are very good at problem solving. So they almost thrive in chaos because they can see a way forward. So it's having vision, and then it's also making sure that the people around you execute. It sounds simple, but it goes back, I think, to very simple principles. That if you're a prime minister, you can take the UK or any other country, and if you don't have hold of your party, that is much more divided than it was even 15, 20 years ago, where everything was much more centrist, then you're going to have a problem because your policies, if you try and please everyone, are going to be all over the place. So you have to like a challenge, and you have to be able to, get everyone on side.
Can I ask you about men and women, male and female leaders, and how you see, if you see, a difference between them because of their gender?
I mean, there's been a lot of studies, right, that I don't necessarily see reflected in the female leaders that I speak to. So a lot of the studies say women tend to bring people together. We know that Angela Merkel, for a long time, was one of the most popular German politicians, less so because of everything that's happened with Nord Stream and some of the immigration policy. But at the time, she was amazing, and she was very useful in G7s and G20s because she brought people together. And so I remember going to a lot of these G7s where she would be the one, if the French president at the time was Sarkozy would get in a hissy fit and walk out, she'd be the one to get him back. I don't know whether that is a feminine trait. I think bringing people together today is probably needed as much as, even more than before. I hear a lot from female leaders from other female leaders, for example, look at the chancellor here and say, is she getting a tougher time because she's a female? I don't know the answer to that. I know other female leaders, bank CEOs, they're very few and far between. Christine Lagarde at the ECB. I mean, you could count them really on the hand. And they sometimes ask those questions. I often ask what the most difficult times for them is, right? So in all their careers, and all of them say, look, it's either going in front of Parliament, or the Treasury Select Committee, or even testifying before Congress in the US. And all of the females will tell me they over-prepare much more than the men because they want to be ready for it. Maybe the male leaders want to say it less. I don't know if there's a fundamental reason. But there are fewer females in charge than there was even 10 years ago.
Let us go to our poll, if we may, since we've been discussing political leaders. We've been talking about what leadership looks like close up. I want to bring you into this, if I may. We have a number of questions, as you've probably gathered, in Britain about who will lead the country and what kind of leadership is demanded over the next 5 years. The general election needs to be held by August 15th, 2029, although it feels like a sort of perma campaign at the moment. If you take a look at the QR code, you'll find a choice on your phone of who you think will be running the UK in 5 years' time. I note in the list there is precisely one woman. And whilst we do that, because you have spoken, I think, recently to two on the list, Wes Streeting and Andy Burnham. How did you find them?
So Andy Burnham was 10 days before the local elections.
Right.
And, it was a very short 10-minute interview so he thought there was a misunderstanding because I was in Madrid for a cities conference, where there's a conference of mayors. And his deputy mayor came on and said, oh, Andy's really looking forward to meeting you and looking forward to talking about cities. And I said, well, hold on a second. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about cities, but there's this little thing called the local elections, which we can't ignore. And what I appreciated is that, A, they didn't cancel the interview. And she said, oh, hold on, that's not what we were planning. Let me bring it over and you can discuss with him. So this was before the live interview. And he said, look, I'm not, I don't really want to talk too much about the domestic issues. And I said, no problem, I'll ask, and you just say you don't want to talk about it. And so we talked about it.
Okay. I hope you have been voting.
So he was quite hands-on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that was for me a good sign.
Yeah. Yeah, you have been voting. Tell me, if you could, briefly about Wes Streeting, then we'll discuss the results.
So Wes Streeting, I spoke to him 10 days ago at South by Southwest. We had 45 minutes together, so it was a significantly longer interview. It was skewed towards tech. A lot of the questions, he's very good. He's a great talker. A lot of the questions he tried not to answer too much. Right. Especially on Palantir and what he would do with some of the government contract if he was in charge. And I was a little bit frustrated. I tried to push him on it. And I think there's something very peculiar and very difficult, and I try and remind myself so that I don't get frustrated, in someone who hasn't put his officially his name, right, in the ring to become prime minister. And so you don't want to campaign too early. So in terms of policies, there's almost like a fine art of when you really want to start, talking about policies and campaigning, and when you really want to give answers, because otherwise, the voters will hold you account. So he was a very good talker.
But didn't say very much?
Didn't answer any of the difficult questions that I think he'll have to answer if there's a real leadership contest, and if he's one of them. I mean, he was very interested. We talked a lot about Andy Burnham, actually.
Right.
And he said, he knows he's the underdog. If Mayor Burnham gets to be in Parliament and whether he runs. Wes Streeting, I thought he was very, very honest in saying, look, I'm not going to say that he's not a good leader, but I'd like to see him tested.
Okay. You can see the results.
43% for Nigel Farage.
For Nigel Farage. This is who people think, not necessarily would like, to be running the UK in 5 years' time. Before we go into the personalities, can we just talk about what you think you'll be watching to think about the political direction of Britain? I mean, whether it is, parties being able to give a strong narrative, whether it's living standards, cost of living, whether it is the markets, what will you be looking to?
So I don't think it'll be the markets. I think the markets play a function of trying to hold people into account, but I don't think anyone goes in the voting booth and says, maybe in the US, just because the consumer is much closer to the equity markets because there's a lot more retail investing. In the UK, I don't think they'll look at the markets unless there's some kind of market event or market crash, like it happened with Liz Truss, where people just worry that the mess, or that the country will be in a mess economically. I think people, given where we are now, will think about immigration. I think this is what swung the vote in the US, and it's probably the same here, could be here in the UK, and that certainly would explain, the polling that Nigel Farage has, and maybe your thoughts on who will be prime minister. And then I think it's affordability. And affordability, again, goes to things that are kind of out of politicians' hands. It goes to inflation that has been largely driven by what's been happening with the price of oil and the Middle East. I know the UK is a small open economy. So they are also much more hurt by some of, the price of energy than, say, France and Germany. They are much more vulnerable to swing in mortgages, so maybe that's a little bit of the markets because they're so dependent on investors. But I think at the end of the day, where people are in their voting booth is, the only question that matters is, am I better off than I was 5 years ago? Are my children going to be better off than I was when I was their age?
Respond, if you will, to what you see there. I mean, there's been a polling lead now for Reform UK for a considerable amount of time, but that is such a convincing margin, saying that Nigel Farage will be leading in 5 years' time. I mean, someone who has not held political office, someone who has been in Parliament for, 2 years, someone who is a very proud outsider, and yet our audience is pretty convinced that he will lead the country in 5 years' time. What do you make of it?
So partly it's polling, partly it is because he's come out of nowhere that people think it's kind of unstoppable. I mean, anything, his popularity would have been unthinkable for 2-3 years ago, and he's been on the scene for many years. I think his party is completely untested on the economy. I think we haven't really seen any policies, like we haven't with Andy Burnham, and actually a lot of people that have to be tested. And again, 5 years, a lot of things can happen in 5 years. How this country deals with AI, how it deals with inflation, what the Bank of England does, how it does with attracting investment and attracting business, I think will make a huge, huge impact on the thinking. We've been trying to think Keir Starmer's not popular, right? That's an understatement.
Sure.
Why? Because in the budgets, they've been trying to throw everything at it. There hasn't been big surprises, but he just hasn't been convincing. So if you have a Labour leader that is convincing, maybe that changes.
If it is Nigel Farage going into Downing Street in, mid-2029, how would you anticipate investor and market reaction?
Again, I mean, it really I'd have to have him here and ask him about fiscal policy and deficit, which for the moment.
Given that Reform UK is entirely untested and has, at the moment, fairly limited economic policies, do you think that would be of concern, or do you think by that point we will know enough that they will have reassured people?
I think there are two types of politicians that have been untested. I think, Giorgia Meloni was one. People were worried about the fact that she'd be fiscally reckless. There was a lot of worry that she'd be too close to Russia, and she managed to find a middle ground. We'd have much better idea, maybe the people around Nigel Farage that understand the economy. At the moment, he has been picking a fight with the Bank of England governor.
Yep.
And I think if there are more fights that go to the central bank independence, this would make him lose credibility with the economy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's if you're very close to power, right, or if you're very close to winning, do you suddenly become much more centrist on the economy and then keep your views on everything else? I mean, it's a template that has worked for certain countries in Europe, I would say better than other templates. If you mess around with the economy too much, people tend not to like that because it really changes their livelihoods and mortgages.
Do you see the political turmoil that drives the popularity of Nigel Farage? Do you see that around the world as well, in particular, I guess, in Europe?
I mean, this is a party that's been really campaigning for, it's an anti-immigration party for a number of reasons that goes to, again, jobs, globalization, that is a little bit more inward-looking. And you see patterns of that emerging, starting with the US.
But it's an anti-system party as well as an anti-immigration party, isn't it?
It's an anti-system party that Italy tried 3-4 years ago and then went back to a little bit more mainstream. Yeah. It's I'm fed up with whatever is coming next feeling. And that goes, I think, to the multiple forces that our society is having to deal with. When you speak to leaders, and again, we speak about leaders and we talk about chief executive and prime minister, but what is a leader? A leader is someone who makes decisions for people. So you could be a leader of 4 or 5 employees and you have to make that decision very well. I think it's very unsettling at the moment to look at where the world economy goes. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, there was a much clearer view, if you put the financial crisis to one side, but there was a much clearer view on, I have kids, my kids will become doctors, or they'll do this, or there's, the globalization people believed in. So people went along with what the elite were telling them for a while. And I don't know if it's not worked, or with the rise of China and a lot of the emerging markets, where they've been doing goods that are much cheaper, it kind of puts the whole business model a little bit on the brink.
Coming back to Nigel Farage, what seems different about him and Reform UK is the very intense focus on him, unlike, say, in France or in Germany, where the Populist Party, it has its figures, but it seems more broad-based. There appear to be alternatives to simply one person. Am I right in that? Do you think that's a fair analysis? Or, again, do you think that there is a very heavy focus on personality?
No, I think the focus on the personality, and that's probably because of the advent of social media, is probably everywhere. Right. So Italy has Matteo Salvini, France, has Marine Le Pen, and now Jordan Bardella.
Yeah.
And so it's people that crystallize, I guess, the imagination of something that is anti-system. I mean, you have the same in Germany with the AfD.
Yeah.
And so it's ideas that suddenly also become, what I hear a lot about Nigel Farage, because he's also on TV, and so that's the way that you speak to citizens is much clearer or more direct. Is that he speaks like them and he thinks like them, and I think again that's a very powerful tool, and you see the same in France when people speak about. I mean, Marine Le Pen has a different connotation because of her father, and she's been around for a very long time, but it goes back to people can relate to the uneasiness that they're seeing in these world forces, I think.
And in that sense, leadership has changed because of changes in technology, because of the environment having changed around them. The importance of communication then is multiplied over and over again.
It is, but because of a lot of social media.
Yeah.
Like I remember, 10, 15 years ago, let's say 20 years ago, if you were a central banker, you'd come on Bloomberg to try and give a message to markets.
Yeah.
Now when you speak to central bankers, and it could be the ECB or the Bank of England, they feel like they need to speak to the person that takes out the mortgage because they want to make sure that people understand what they do. So there's much more pressure to be understood. Now, it's fine to understand about inflation and central bankers. I don't know if people want to understand that. I mean, it's kind of the plumbing. As long as it works, I don't know whether it's we need to understand exactly, the swaps and the gilt market. But a lot of leaders feel that so that they're not misportrayed, they need to speak directly to the consumers, to the people. And I think it's the same for chief executives. I think it's the same for world leaders. I mean, I started doing this funny, 1.5 minute video where I talk about the 5 things that I look at every day. And I started doing it for my friend Alexander, who had 4 kids in COVID and said, I don't have time for news, I'm becoming more stupid by the hour. Fine. Is there a politician that doesn't do that? Yeah. And so why? Because they feel like they need to connect, and it's much better if it's told through their eyes and their own voice.
Given the place that Europe, in particular, I guess Britain, France, and Germany find themselves in with their current leadership, do you see a generation of leaders coming up that Europe needs? Germany is in a dreadful struggle. Macron is staggeringly unpopular. We know about Keir Starmer. Do you see people in the pipeline that are the kind of leaders that will fire up the imagination of electorates and citizens?
I think less people, and I saw a poll recently, less people want to go into politics. So it means that the number of people that you can choose from is getting smaller. It's also extremely difficult for a politician to be everything to everyone, which is kind of needed, right? So you have to be able to speak to the media and be good at the media. You have to be able to, hold your party together, even if there are various factions, and becomes messier. And I think as soon as you show a little bit of a sign of weakness, then other people want to challenge you. And I'm not necessarily speaking about the UK, but there is, we went through it in a lot of countries in Europe, and that if you don't do a good job, your party doesn't give you a lot of time to recuperate. They don't give you the time, even 2-3 years, to see where it lands. And with all these external geopolitical kind of whirlwinds, I think it's much harder.
Do you think there is a difference between the leadership cultures of big regions of the globe? I mean, US, Europe, China. Do you think there is a different way of treating leaders, or is it all similarly ruthless and difficult?
So I've been trying to get into China for an extended period of time for a long time.
Right.
And I've been trying to understand exactly what China wants, what China brings, how China views the world. Yeah. And I've always been told that the smartest students want to serve their country, want to serve their party. So you go into business for a while, and then you want to be part of the party to kind of give back. It also means that because there are not elections every 3-4 years, and I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing, but you can see longer term, which is why their attachment and the way that they think about problem solving, if you have 10-15 years where you can get to natural resources, where you can get to copper and lithium, it's much easier than if you have to be popular every second of the day because you're worried about seeing votes. So the psyche is completely different. Yeah. Yeah. And so having more time means that you can build better foundations.
And between Europe and the US, or do you think they are roughly equivalent, the leadership cultures?
I mean, I think Donald Trump changed everything. I think there's not much, dissent in the Republican Party. Yeah. That means that he's in control and he has support. I've also been told something quite, for me, surprising by a big Wall Street banker recently, because we were talking about the fact that it's very difficult to know U.S. policy. I mean, it's really difficult to understand whether there's a real deal with Iran or not. The latest is this memorandum of understanding. I think it's the 28th time that the president said that we're going to have something concrete. I mean, you've done foreign policy all your life. Yeah. 10 years ago, if the president of the U.S. said, there's a deal, there's a deal. Yeah. Now it's not, it's not clear, and it kind of goes backwards and forwards. And this big Wall Street banker who's been around for 30 years told me, no, you're thinking about it wrong. You shouldn't look at policy through tweets. I'm like, so how do you look at policy? And he says, look at the advisors you need to have connections in. I mean, the way that leaders communicate also, I remember getting a press statement, and sometimes you were able to listen in to, press conferences, or even when the President of the United States was speaking to staff. Now it's different. It's policy by tweets, all times of day. And so that, the communication is very different, and I think we're used to it a lot more.
But there's no spillover from that kind of leadership into the business world. There's still a different way of doing things when it comes to the CEOs and COOs that you talk to.
Well, the business world has to figure out what's policy and what's not,
sure.
Right? So they need to cut out what the noise is. And so when you look at these policies, they kind of have to decide whether they believe it or not. And I think there's a huge amount of FOMO in the market. So if the president tells you, every 3 days that they're very close to a deal, well, you don't want to miss out. I mean, at the end of the day, the market is there to put the money, so to make money. So you don't want to be on the wrong side of the trade. You don't want to miss the time where there actually is a deal, which is why the market has been behaving a lot badly. I mean, weirdly, I don't know if there are many markets people, but if you look at oil, this is a conversation that we have almost every day. It's like, why has it been, okay? So some of the disruption has been priced in, but there has been an optimistic belief in the market that a deal could have been reached, even if all the military folk were saying, look, we're not seeing how a deal gets through on nuclear and things like that. And I think it's because you can't really afford to bet against the US president.
Just a reminder, we're going to come to questions from the audience. We have questions coming in from people who are watching online. Thank you very much for those. And we'll come to questions in about 15 minutes' time. Let us talk on something you have touched on, which is AI, and we talk more and more in these gatherings about the impact of AI, unsurprisingly. Do you feel confident even talking about, who will gain and who will lose? Do you have any sense that where you will be 6 months, 12 months, 2 years down the line with AI?
No, and I don't think the people that are building it themselves know. And my favorite question to ask, especially if it's off camera, is where's China in all of this? And I'm often told, don't worry, they're 6 to 8 months away. It's like 6 to 8 months away. I mean, that feels awfully close. So I don't think who will be the big winner. I don't think there is one winner. There could be 2 or 3. I have a hunch, but again, it could change, that it is the US. And I think the only 2 people in the race is US and China. I think you do have companies such as Mistral AI in France. That's considered one of, Europe's greatest hope for AI. But actually what they do is going to be vastly different, because they will integrate, unless there's a big sea change, they will integrate some of these models in enterprise. And so the way I would see it is, not everyone can afford a Ferrari. Not everyone can afford, millions of pounds to spend on Claude or some of these very expensive digital tokens that a lot of the companies are using now. And so you'll have spin-off models that will kind of take these super sexy models and integrate it into their system. So again, when you speak to a lot of the chief executives, especially the very sophisticated ones, I mean, we've reported on instances where, what a person is spending on digital tokens, which means what they're spending in their day-to-day job to play around with AI, is higher than their salary. I mean, this is not really sustainable. And so when you speak to the people in charge, they say, well, I want them to play around at the moment, but at some point I'm going to have to look at costs, and that will have to change.
Do the people that you speak to feel they understand the capabilities of AI?
I mean, I think the chief executives that are, I guess, the most honest will say, I understand it's important and I don't want to miss out, but I don't have a full understanding of what this will become. A little bit like Amazon. I mean, we looked back because of the SpaceX IPO at some of the big moments in time where, in recent times, where, for example, Amazon, I mean, when they IPO'd, people were saying, like, what, books? Online? I quite like my bookstore. Yeah. And so you understand that there's something that you can't miss out on. You understand that it's something that will probably change the way we work, that will make us more productive. Everybody thought it was disinflationary, but actually it is definitely inflationary in the shorter term because of the amount being spent in the race. And so they understand to some extent how it can change, but they're also still playing around with it.
What of the regulators? What of nation states again? You talk to central banks in particular, I guess. Do they feel they are strong enough? Do they feel they are keeping up with the race?
Well, for me, the big problem, and I hear that a lot from people in leadership position, is that as soon as you talk about regulating, business say, well, that's a European problem. You regulate because you can't innovate. And so it's almost a dirty word to talk about regulation. So social media is one thing, and maybe we can talk about, the ban for social media and under 16s, which is completely different. But if you start thinking about these these ideas that you would regulate artificial general intelligence, or how much you use it, or how, or the access you can have to it, I think at the moment it's seen as a bad word. I think you're seen as not an innovator, as you're seen as backward-looking, as a dinosaur. And so apart from a few parliamentarians in Europe that still look at it very seriously, I think businesses really push back against regulation.
And do you believe that AI will erode sovereignty of nations? I mean, they may not control the technology. They'll still be the ones making decisions about welfare benefits, about going to war, about, where people cross the road, all these kinds of issues. But how does AI touch on that?
So I think there's a problem if you're sitting in Europe at the moment, because you could see a world where you integrate your systems, and this we haven't really been able to get to the bottom of, but you integrate your systems in the NHS or your warfare or your defense systems, and because it's American technology, do you have fully ownership of that, or is there a kill switch that the U.S. government can say, right, that's it, you need to change? So again, the doomsayers will say you're going to have 2 to 3 systems where the US will be much more advanced and kind of driving this. Europe will be left behind somewhere in the middle, and China will go out their way. I mean, that is, I think, the big risk for Europe and European sovereignty. You hear a lot of chief executives trying to integrate these systems and saying, I wish I had a European equivalent, because that would make my life easier, because I would feel more supported and I'd feel better at ease on this question of sovereignty. I know there's also a huge debate with regulators of banks, be it central bank, ECB, or the banks themselves, saying, well, the US have a really unfair advantage because they've been playing around with Mythos and they can't get their hands on it. Does that equalize in 3-4 years? Do you need, is it really first mover advantage at everything? I'm not sure, but I think Europe really wishes they had some of these big personalities in Europe. Now there's Demis. Of course, he's UK, he's London-based, Google DeepMind.
You've spoken with him, haven't you?
I've spoken to him many times, and I think he also did an event here. I think he speaks quite truthfully in saying he is probably now in a race that has so many billions at stake that some of the questions that he would like to think about, which is regulation, which is the future of humanity, don't really come into this, right? And we know Dario Amodei is thinking about it. But again, if you're in a race to make money, to be the first, if it's technological advancements that you need to push through, it's difficult to take time out of that to think about regulation or some of these big philosophy kind of morality questions that we'll be faced with.
What do you make of it's a clumsy phrase, but the sort of cult of the founder, this astonishing elevation of a very few individuals who created these vastly powerful companies? So
I get asked a lot, is he a good guy? Is she a good person? I don't think it means anything. You can be a good person with the best intentions. I think when you are in charge of companies that make billions of pounds that have a value of $1 trillion once you're listed, if you don't deliver that commercial, revenue, then you will be get rid of. And so it doesn't really matter if you're a good person or not. Like once you're...
Do these people still have agency?
People have agency, but at the end of the day, once you're listed, you have shareholders that you have to reply to, right? And so now is probably the time to think about all of that. But I do see the zealous regulation that was maybe in Europe 4 or 5 years ago has been a little bit lost because of this race that's being accelerated.
Are you confident from what you know about the people who lead these companies that they are responsible people to hold the fate of humanity in their hands?
I think it's too big for any person. I don't think it's right, or certainly they probably don't think it's right that it belongs to one single entity. And so I think it'll be tricky.
Let us talk about the questions that we've received. I'm going to do an online question while we get your questions first. A simple one here. Are people unfair to Keir Starmer? In what way has he actually failed as PM? It's a leadership question.
It is a leadership question. I think he's seen as not having the right temperament, right? I think that's probably his biggest flaw. There's the Mandelson saga, which definitely didn't go well for him. And if you analyze that, it was almost a very, simple leadership problem that he wasn't aware to the extent of how toxic Peter Mandelson was. Now, in every good leadership lesson, whether you're a prime minister or a chief executive, you have to foster a culture where people kick up real concerns. And the fact that he was unable to do that, I don't know if it's a sackable offense, but certainly it doesn't look great on the CV. I think maybe people expect too much of leaders today, given all of the uncertainty. They want to be led. They want to feel safe. And again, the other leadership lesson is that you have to hold your party, right? If people didn't challenge him, he's been having a lot of bad weeks. I know the local elections, they go to plan. But if you don't have your party behind you, then it becomes really, really difficult.
And what people home in on is the lack of the sort of charismatic role in him, which I think is sometimes neglected with politicians because they have so many other things to do as well. But it's pretty critical, actually. It is actually a part of the job, isn't it?
It is. I don't know if it should be. So I have a very weird relationship with the word charismatic because usually it means that you're upbeat, that you get people involved. But if it's not based on substance, then what is it? I think the fighting spirit is maybe what I would look for. Decisiveness is something that's important in leaders, rather than charisma. But you're right. Charisma has elected presidents, have failed presidents in all parts of the world, in the US, in the UK, certainly has in France, Italy, and even Germany. So you have to believe your leader. Like at the end of the day, there's a social contract, which was started in the 18th century, which is, look, I give this, I work, but the state does this for me. And the does this depends on whether you're right or left. It could be completely deregulate and make you agent of your own destiny, or it can say, look, I'm going to give you social welfare, social security, and take care of you in difficult times. And this is what the social contract is. And again, it means different things to different cultures, different countries, but there is an understanding that the leader takes care of you somehow. If you don't feel that in a leader, that's when people feel lost and they want to change.
Let's talk, if we could, to our audience here. I'm going to take groups of 3 questions. Gentleman here, gentleman there, and lady here. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you about a question to do with public-private partnerships. And I want to compare, for example, NASA and SpaceX. They can be seen as innovative in terms of the success. And here in London, I can think of the success of the Elizabeth line and how it's been successful. So at the moment, I feel there's too much doom and gloom. And do you think that there needs to be some kind of innovative communication bringing the public and private sectors together, like Mariana Mazzucato has suggested. And what's your take on that, please?
We'll take the other two questions and then come to you. Thank you. Sir.
Just reflecting on the poll results earlier, do you think over the next 3 years the consequences of Brexit will begin to turn the tide on that expectation of a sort of strong Farage showing in a future election?
Thank you. And the lady at the front here.
Thank you so much for this. God, there's so many questions I want to ask, but I will try to restrain myself. The first one is, do you see any leadership coming out of the middle powers, so to speak, right now? Because this is one of the big kind of mega trends at the moment, is what are the middle powers going to do? And especially when it comes to AI and digital sovereignty and some of the topics we've raised here. And the second little question is just, what do you see amongst all these powerful people that you see as a mega trend amongst them? Like, what do you see consistently as you interview them that stands out as a pattern, let's say?
Thank you very much indeed. The first question about public-private partnerships, the need for innovation as a way of escaping some of the doom and gloom there is at the moment.
So it's a great question, and I've spoken to Mariana Mazzucato a lot about this. She looks at it a little bit differently from some of the global institutions. So again, the IMF is very open to public-private partnerships. Brookfield Asset Manager also does quite a lot of public-private partnerships, especially when it comes to infrastructure. Now, Professor Mazzucato's main point, which is difficult to disagree with, is that when you have a public-private partnership and you get money from a state actor, you need to make sure that you get something back. So she says, in the contract, if I'm the state, you're private, I give you money for innovation, I need to get something back, right? This is not free money that goes and then you go to the US or somewhere else. And I have a lot of sympathy for that, right? There's a lot of the public-private partnerships, especially in the US, where the founders were locked in, right, to explore some of that with universities. I mean, the UK has, for me, the most amazing universities in the world, right? They compete, sure, with MIT and a couple in the US. You've had innovation. You've had a lot of the vaccines, and that was, useful, and that was public-private money that worked together. In a lot of the other places, you need to make sure that there's a mutual understanding that this is a business, that we go in it together, and I, as the state, reap some of the rewards. Because otherwise, then it goes to different parts of the world. And this, I think, is more relevant to innovation. So if you look at some of these partnerships in the past, they were on infrastructure. So on infrastructure, okay, we come together, we do a road, we do an airport, and we share the profits. There's not much of the innovation that has to go anywhere. But as we look to the future, and some of these new technologies, that has to be baked in. And I tried to ask, actually, Mariana Mazzucato, if this was because we weren't good at thinking about these contracts between the government, because they were not used to it. And innovation at this level, the US has just been much stronger on it, because from the start, 40, 50 years ago, this was a matter of political influence. So if you look at the space race, I mean, this was really a matter of getting your allies hooked to some of their technologies. And so it was treated just like a trade policy. And I think Europe, for a long time, failed to see that.
Thank you. The next one was about the poll which we held and the sort of rather hefty lead that Nigel Farage had there. Would as the consequences of Brexit play out, the economic consequences, I presume the gentleman is talking about primarily, do you think that affects the popularity of Nigel Farage? Does it change people's minds?
So we did a brilliant report last week, actually, because it's 10 years of Brexit. And so we looked at, some of the median deviation on growth. I think what we'd said from the start is that it's very difficult to untangle the effects of Brexit compared to the rest of the world, right? So there's an energy crisis, there was trade. And so I think even if there's a poll that says that some people would like to rejoin, I think it'd be very difficult to actually prove, at the end of the day, exactly what kind of effects it's had, because it all gets muddled into one, right? So is my energy cost higher because of the trade, because I wasn't allowed to trade with Europe, or was it because of everything that's been happening in Ukraine and the central bank? So I think, hindsight is a beautiful thing, but I think it's very difficult for this to be played out and for politicians to say, you see, this is because of Brexit. And if you can't pinpoint to something, voters don't tend to agree with you. I mean, voters have a nagging feeling about something not right. They just don't feel good about the economy. So when we look at charts, sure, it's affordability, it's housing, it's education, it's inflation. But sometimes they're not able to really explain why. And I think the relationship between the UK and the EU is very difficult to, I mean, you can put it into numbers, but the Brexit vote was a bit more of a feeling than numbers. And so I don't know, we've seen it play out. It's been 10 years. If Nigel Farage is popular now, I don't think there's going to be a big switch because of Brexit. Maybe there's a big switch because of something else, but I don't think Brexit will be the one that changes people's minds.
Leadership from middle powers, in particular on AI and digital sovereignty. Do you see it?
Yeah, so the middle power, look, Mark Carney, right, is a little bit of the beacon of, and he called Canada middle power. And I was in Davos, actually. He gave an incredible speech where he really was very honest about the fact that we're not going back to the old world. And I do think it's a human trait to want to hang on to what you've known all of your life, so the benefits of globalization and things like that. He hasn't been able really to form an alliance. I mean, I remember from, I don't know if it was January 20th or 21st, we were kind of on the watch out and saying, well, could you see a kind of alliance with, so Canada, the UK, maybe Finland, for some kind of trade bloc that would somehow be, the David and Goliath masterful fight with the US. That hasn't really been proven. I don't think it means it won't happen, because I think maybe under closed doors there is a lot more organization, and countries will want to help themselves if they have the same beliefs, because we are seeing trading blocs change depending on whether you're an ally or not in terms of thinking. But again, it will take a long time to play out. I don't think it's something of tomorrow. I think Mark Carney maybe would have wanted more countries to say, oh, yeah, I'm in, let's do this together. And that hasn't really quite played out, because even decoupling from the US or disaligning it is very tough at the moment. I mean, the US has a very strong economy, no matter what you think about the president and his leadership style. The innovation is coming from the US. Productivity is coming from the US. And I'm hearing more chief executives saying, well, actually, I'm thinking of listing in the US, rather than say, oh, you know what, I don't really want to do business in the US. So it's quite, it's complicated going forwards, but something to think about.
And there was a second question as well. Do you see a sort of mega trend amongst the leaders that you speak to? I mean, is there anything you could point to where you say, this is how they act, this is how they speak, this is... Exactly.
I mean, what drives them, I think, is success, right? And it usually works if it's success I mean, I don't know if it's great or good. That's a little bit like, rose water. But if it's something that says, look, we're in this together and we'll do better. There's a pattern which I've been seeing in people, how they see problems. And a lot of the people that are most successful look at data. And this is not for politicians, I'm speaking about chief executives, but they look at data and they're able to see in the data a pattern where it doesn't work out. And this is where they're able to either spot opportunities. Then I see a lot of just common sense, right? I mean, so I do a leadership podcast with chief executives. And the one that really resonates with our viewers is where someone says, well, you know what's really important is not promoting the wrong kind of people. I mean, it doesn't get more basic than that. Yeah. But if you have large organizations, that gets lost. And so it's having common sense and kind of going back to, leading in the same way if you had 10 people than if you have 100,000. That kind of usually gets them a little bit ahead.
Question from our online audience. Are we seeing global and American political and business leaders beginning to stand up to Donald Trump?
No.
There we go.
I don't.
Moving swiftly on.
No, I don't. Look, in the U.S., there's always chatter about, some of the Republicans saying, I'm going to stand up to him, or the business people saying, look. But at the end of the day, he's delivering what they want, right? So they ignore all of the social stuff, and they say, well, I want deregulation. I'm getting deregulation. I want a strong economy. I get a strong economy. I want, a consumer spending superpower, and that's happening. Now, that is largely driven by AI. I don't think it's driven by what the U.S. is putting in place. But because AI, there's so much capex, there's billions of money being spent, people feel good about it, they go out, they spend. And so chief executives, by and large, are quite happy in I wouldn't say supporting, but not speaking out against him. I mean, the president has also humiliated a lot of chief executives that haven't gone the way he has. And so people would rather just not get entangled in that.
There has been more international political sort of backlash or pushback rather than backlash, hasn't there? I mean, the early months saw a lot of, probably unfortuitous phrase, taking the knee to Donald Trump. Europe sort of rather picked up its game and discovered that it could push back, in particular over Greenland and things like that. There was more. There were more voices raised there.
There was, and then you have comments here and there from the German chancellor about, he was, I think he said it 2 weeks ago, that he hopes his children don't go and work in the U.S. Yeah. But actually, if you look at the way that the president has done trade policy, I think what's been most remarkable is that the rest of the world hasn't retaliated. I mean, April 1st, Liberation Day last year, you had no idea what could happen. So there was a chart, and he said, look, I'm going to, raise tariffs by this much in this country and this much by this country. And you could have foreseen every country saying, well, you know what, I'm going to do 30%. You go 10%, I'm going to go 40%. And actually, by and large, everyone has been pretty much on the back foot. And this is why we have a world economy that's still functioning. Because if you retaliate at every step with a president that could get angry and put trade barriers and trade tariffs even up, it could have been really messy. So I think people stand up to him, people say things, but politically you just can't decouple. You can't move away from the U.S. And so people have been speaking enough so that the population of that country doesn't feel like they're being had for lunch, but not quite far enough, I think, in fighting back.
Let's go to our audience for more questions if we could. Gentleman here. Gentleman there. I'm going to look vaguely and here, if we could. So, sorry, could you put your hand up again so the microphone can come to you? Thank you very much.
Yeah, we spoke about Farage, and I believe one of the reasons why he has success is that he found a way to exploit the rage and the frustration of people. And you see that in many countries in Europe why extreme right is successful. And immigration is obviously an easy tool to use. So what should be the response of our leaders in a society where people are so short-term minded? If you don't deliver results politically in 1 year or two, you're out. And it's impossible to do things in 1 year or two on some of the problems politicals face. So what should be the response of leaders to this huge problem?
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, hi, thank you for the fantastic insights. I want to ask a question about AI theme that we touched on. It's kind of two-part question. How do you see AI affecting, the career projection of people, especially, a lot of young people have the concern of getting their foot in the career ladder and how it affects their role, and generally speaking, also, as we look at small businesses, do you think they will be able to leverage AI, or will be able to kind of compete in an era where larger organizations have more and more AI resources? So yeah, just on those two.
Thank you very much. And gentleman in the front here, microphone coming to you.
First, thank you so much for the talk. I really loved it. And I'm going to ask, I'm afraid, a rather micro question compared with all the huge macro questions that you've been asked. And it's been prompted by the fact that you started your career in the oil and gas industry at Shell, I think you said.
Covering Shell.
Covering Shell,
yeah,
right.
Actually
right.
covering OPEC, which is even more exciting than Shell.
Very
It had
exciting.
everything: treachery, politics, money.
Well, exactly. Now, I have been investing and following the industry for the past 28 years. When you mentioned that, and we were talking about leadership, guess what came into my head? BP. And I thought, maybe you've got some fascinating insights to share with us about, now we've had the chairman of BP, have been Karl-Henrik Svanberg, Helge Lund and Albert Manifold, and then the CEOs have been Bob Dudley, Bernard Looney, Murray Auchincloss, and Meg O'Neill. Any interesting snippets about their leadership capabilities? And I will, well, it's exactly what I thought. You won't be able to answer the questions, and I completely understand.
There's a troublemaker in the front row. Right, first
Maybe
question.
we talk afterwards.
First question. What, I'm not sure if you're in the business of advising politicians, but what possible response is there to the rage and frustration of electorates, to their anger over immigration? Are politicians able to respond to the upsurge in anger that there is in so many different European societies?
I mean, I'm so glad I don't have to give advice to any of the politicians, because it's always been a hard job, but today is a harder job than most. I think Mark Carney has shown a way. I think if you speak, if you're clever and you give a convincing argument on why people should follow you and your way, I think it gets voters. And I think it gets voters in today's day and age. But you have to have someone that really feels it in the belly, that understands what it takes, and has to have an alternative to populism. Mark Carney was, kind of came out of nowhere. I mean, I followed him very closely when he was Bank of England governor, and then he went to the private sector, and he saw an in. And the in was dealing with Donald Trump. And he deals, if you look at a lot of the footage that comes out on when they meet, he deals with him in quite a good way, because it's half, laughing and a sense of humor and keeping him on side, but at the same time, he's pushing back, which for what I can tell, Donald Trump quite respects. It takes a certain type of politician to be able to do that. But there is a way, and I think Macron has been trying to do something similar. He has had a very tough job at home. I mean, again, the problem is that because of these forces, and I go back to these forces that are kind of changing the way that we vote, we think that our livelihoods, and part of that is AI, is that politicians really now have two completely different jobs. One is foreign policy, because you're being attacked from all sides and you're redrawing these, alliances that we thought were given since Bretton Woods. And at the same time, you have a population at home that is going through massive shifts and changes. So you could see, an ideal world where actually it'd be co-managed. You'd have a prime minister or a president, and you do it together, and one focuses on foreign policy and the one they're at home. And I know that's what you have foreign ministers for. Mm-hmm. But I do, I think I think there is a way of getting your thoughts to kind of get voters to vote for you. And I also think at the end of the day, voters want results. So if you don't deliver on results, be it on the left or the right or the populist or the centrist, then they'll want change.
The second question was about, it was two parts. The first, it was about AI. The first part was about a career projection for young people and what you see the impact might be. And the second was about whether or not small businesses in particular could leverage AI.
So I think it's, the cost of small businesses to stay out of this is too enormous. But I think they may not use the models that are extremely expensive. I think at some point, and I know now we're in the race to spend and build, and we're talking about trillions and trillions of pounds. At some point, this technology will have to become much cheaper for everyone to use. Otherwise, it just won't be used enough, and they won't recoup some of their investments. Small businesses, and we speak to a lot of small businesses at the moment, they say, I'm playing around with it. Again, there's a danger, but we haven't really seen, in the data. So anecdotally, we hear of small business owners that have to make the decision about either hiring a graduate or spending more on AI, and they say, I've gone for AI because I don't want to be left behind, but I will go back to the graduate. Is that what you see in the numbers, especially for the youth unemployment? Because it's very tough, especially in the UK, to find a job if you come out of university. There's no real data to support it. So at the moment, it's still an idea or a thought. I don't know what we should study. I speak to 10 chief executives. 5 will say, deep thinking, the humanities, and the other 5 will say, make sure your prompts are okay. I don't really know, and I don't think anybody knows, and I think this is why we have so much uneasiness. I think what I would urge every student is just continue thinking for yourself, because if AI is rolled out to everyone and it's the same models, the ability to spot patterns even in AI will be what makes you a little bit different. So, I don't know if AI will do all the thinking for you. I think that's quite sad because humans are storytellers and thinkers. But if it's a way of collecting information, then use it as much as you can to give you information that then gives you an advantage. But I really don't think we're at a place where we really know. And I think a lot of people that say that they know is a bit of a spin, and usually it just makes their job or what they have to sell a little bit easier. I'm so pessimistic.
Let's talk about BP. You jogged alongside Saudi oil ministers in Vienna to try and get tidbits when you were covering OPEC.
I mean, the jogging got better, so I'm not a runner.
Okay.
And it was easier when the ministers got a little bit older because they slowed down.
They slowed down.
I mean, at the start, it was a really difficult thing to try and jot down notes whilst jogging with them. I don't really have any insight. I was surprised. I mean, I was surprised that he came out fighting and saying that they didn't really have anything on him. Usually when a board finds something, I mean, it never looks good for the market, right, to oust someone. So I would imagine that the board was pretty sure. What is surprising to me, and I had a long interview with the Shell CEO on the podcast, is that I remember interviewing some of the leadership of BP, and they were all about renewables. And actually Shell had the courage to say, well, in this transition period, we just don't want to be that green. And at the time, it was seen as outrageous. And actually, I don't know if it's luck or if they'd foreseen all of this turmoil, but history kind of have gone for them because they've done pretty well. And you don't know what follows, right? If it's leadership or it's just the events that bring the leadership a bit of luck.
I have one from our online audience, and I'm not sure you can answer because I don't know whether it's something you cover at all. What makes a great sporting team? And do they help teams win the World Cup?
Oh, this is tempting because I have one coming up. I have a very big personality, which I can't really talk about. But I think, So I think a lot of leaders, given all the turmoil, given they don't have that much influence over external events, will look into their own performance and leadership. And I've seen much more interest, just like they look to leaders like Churchill or other great statespeople. They look at performers, at coaching managers for advice on what kind of leader they want to become. So for that reason, I'm interviewing a big sports personality for the Leaders podcast. And I don't think we would have done that 5-6 years ago. Yeah. But we decided to go for it. So more to come.
Excellent.
Is that a good teaser?
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, that's very good indeed. I'm going to take one more question online because it sort of jumps in from what the gentleman was talking about there, and whether you get a sense that governments are preparing for the economic consequences of AI, and what Sandra says is the invariable loss of certain jobs, leading to possibly much higher unemployment. When you speak to people in government, do you get the sense that they are preparing or are aware of or are terrified by?
I think that they're very busy about thinking about other things that are more immediate,
right,
like inflation and being reelected. I think when you look, 5, 10 years, again, we don't really know how many jobs will disappear or how many of these jobs will be transformed. I mean, I've read everything. I try and read as much research as I can from a lot of the think tanks and the banks, and I've read everything like 300,000 jobs lost a year to 10,000 or no jobs because they get retrained into something else, which could be programmers or fact checkers. I really don't know. When you speak to politicians, they don't really have the bandwidth to talk, to think about this. And a lot of them don't really think it's their job to retrain the population. So I try and press a lot of the big chief executives that have hundreds of thousands of employees to say, well, is it your job to retrain your workforce so that if you're, for example, a bank and you're not going to use the call center anymore, do you want to make sure that those people know how to retrain and do another job? Some of them say yes. I think those will be successful. Others say no. I think IKEA had a really interesting way of thinking of, for example, AI or automation, which is, I guess, the first steps of AI, is that they retrained a lot of their staff to be designers. Right, so you can go to IKEA and say, right, I want to redo my bedroom or my child's bedroom, and they help you in that. And that was up to a private company to retrain the call center to do that. Yeah. So I would, given politicians and governments have a lot to think about, maybe it is up to the privates to do a little bit more to at least take care of their own staff.
Okay. We have 5 minutes left, so thoughts still from the audience, if we could. Gentleman over there at the end of the row, and then the gentleman here. Thank you very much indeed. We've been very heavy on gentlemen. Ladies are very, very welcome to put their hands up too. Sir.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm keen to hear a bit about your personal experience of hearing all the different people that you've met and the leaders. Could you give us something maybe along the lines of someone who you've met which has been authentic to who they are, hasn't let things like power and influence affect their leadership? Maybe you could give us a story about a person like that you've met. And has there been a moment where you've met someone and there's been a wow moment, a real sort of moment of inspiration, and said, this is different, or this is excellent, and I never expected to hear that? So maybe something from your own experience of from interviewing all these people.
Thank you very much, sir. And the gentleman here. Pop your hand up again. Thank you, sir.
Yes, you mentioned earlier about a couple of aides stepping in for Prime Minister and sort of trying to guide an interview in a certain place. In terms of Trump, how much sort of guidance are his aides giving, and is it his idea goes, or is there much more of a wider strategy behind the things that are going on?
Thank you very much indeed. The first question or questions, someone who struck you as truly authentic and a wow moment when you've sat down with an interviewee.
I mean, look, there have been so many because I do so many, and so it's like choosing amongst your children. I mean, you like all of these moments equally. The first time I interviewed Jonny Dymond, it was quite something, because he's, considered as very able, very direct. He's a tough interview if you're not used to it, because he's so intense in his answers that you really don't have time to look at your notes. I mean, you're there, it's like, you're not boxing, but he'll ask you questions. He'll say, well, what do you think? And so you just have to be prepared for the intensity. And I'm always really surprised at how much stamina he has, and I think it's on and off stage. You have people that, disappointed afterwards for a number of reasons. Like Carlos Ghosn, the first time I interviewed, I mean, he is so smart. And then you follow his journey and you say, well, what happened? So you have people that, you see in a certain context, and they could be the smartest, and then they end up messing up something or the other. There are moments where CEOs are vulnerable, where they let their guard down, which have stayed with me. There was, I covered a lot of the Swiss banks, and when a bank takes over and the CEO becomes a little bit emotional about it and sheds a tear, you're not used to seeing on TV those moments of vulnerability, or where they apologize for shareholders. And some of them, they come on air and give you a lot of breaking news, or some news that you're not expecting, or how they think about something. So I've had a lot of moments, because I've been doing this for quite some time. And then I guess you make assumptions sometimes, right? Chief executives from a small company that you think, oh, they're not going to be that punchy. And actually they really fight back, and you can just see in the interviews that they have a vision, and they believe in their employees, and they believe in their business model. And you can't help but being behind them just because of the passion they bring. So I don't know if there's one specific moment. I sometimes think, some people are also very awkward. I mean, one of my favorite things when I was younger was doorstepping. So I don't know if anybody, everybody knows what doorstepping is, but this is when you chase, usually political leaders out of a conference. And so there's a real art to doorstepping, because first there's 100 journalists, and you have to make sure that the person comes to you and answers a question. And I was stuck in an elevator. I mean, this was so awkward, with Gordon Brown when he was prime minister. And this was, we went up 8 floors. And usually, so I have a cameraman, we managed to get into this very small space. He was flanked by 2 bodyguards. And I ask a question, usually they look at you and they say, no thanks. And he just looked at his shoes. So then I think, right, I need to continue asking questions. I mean, it was a very long 3 minutes up the 8th floor. And you kind of wonder, was it just awkwardness? Was he not sure what to do? And I was like, look, if he's not going to say anything, I kind of have to do my job and my duty to continue asking questions. So that moment really stayed with me. And, there are others that they would come out of a big meeting and they'd look at you and say, I would love to speak to you, but I can't speak to you. So you'd have to call your editor. And they'd say, what? Did you not push him? But because they had a nice way about them, you kind of said, well, they're not going to speak. So these moments stay. I think it's the deeply human moments when you have an interaction with someone. That could be 2 or 3 in the morning if it's a big, for example, EU summit, and they come out of those little corridors.
If I can share a Gordon Brown moment, I was waiting at an EU summit for Gordon Brown. I was doing the pool interview for all British broadcasters, and we waited and we waited. He was very, very late. About half an hour I've been standing in this room, and as he came towards me, one of his aides leant in and said very, very sort of audibly, the reporter's name is Jonny Dymond. And he stood in front of me, and I said, hello, Prime Minister. And he said, hello. And I thought it's the easiest thing in the world to say, hello, Johnny. Hello, hello. So I think he's looking at his shoes because he can't think what to say to you. Right, the final question was about the Trump circle, about whether he takes advice and whether we understand where that advice comes from and whether he listens to it.
No, I don't. I don't think he listens to it. I know, I'm quite close to some of his aides. He doesn't like read prompts so much. I listen to almost all of his speeches, often because I'm on air or I'm, where he is, and I actually enjoy going to try and understand the room and read the room and figure out exactly what all of this means. And if you saw, for example, I'm thinking of his big speech in Davos, but you don't look at his big speech in China, is that he reads off the prompter and then it goes into different directions, and that's when he's just ad-libbing. And usually if you look at his aides, they're looking at the ceiling going, oh, we're not sure if this is half an hour or an hour. So I think he's his own agent, he's his own man, and he kind of does what he wants. I know a lot of people will say his policy fluctuates on who he's spoken to last. I don't know that. But sometimes there are, things that come out that you wonder where it comes from, because we know that he hasn't been briefed in the old good-fashioned way. So I think it's a different world.
We're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much. Thanks to Guinness Global Investors. Thanks to Intelligence Squared. But most of all, thanks to Francine.
Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank
That was
you.
lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.